Udry the White Feather, the howling wind across the Murmansk tundra, carries the acrid smell of burning oil and cordite as Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov adjusts his grip on the Mosin-Nagant PU sniper rifle, its 3.5x scope fogged despite his careful breath control. Below him, through the twisted wreckage of what was once a supply convoy, he can hear voices, not Russian, but something else. German, perhaps, but the accent is wrong. Junior Sergeant Petrov whispers urgently beside him, "Dmitri, those are civilians down there, Finnish refugees trying to cross back to their lines." It is December 1942, and the siege of Leningrad has created a nightmare landscape where battle lines shift like smoke, where friend and enemy become impossible to distinguish in the endless polar night. Volkov earned his nickname White Feather, not for any romantic notion of death from above, but for his peculiar habit of tucking a single white ptarmigan feather into his ushanka, a small ritual that somehow steadies his nerves when the world around him descends into chaos. His superiors have always mocked this superstition, calling it the foolish sentiment of a man too soft for the sniper's trade. "Calm under fire," they sneer, "comes from steel, not feathers." But now, as Volkov touches the white feather through the wool of his cap, he feels the familiar settling in his chest that has always preceded his most precise shots. Through his scope, he watches as 15 Finnish civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men, huddle around the smoking remains of their makeshift shelter. They are attempting to cross the no-man's land between Soviet and Finnish positions, carrying nothing but threadbare bundles and a desperate hope of reaching safety. The youngest among them, a girl who cannot be more than 8 years old, clutches a torn doll against her chest with the fierce protectiveness that only children possess for their treasures. What they don't know, what Volkov can see clearly from his elevated position, is that a German SS patrol has been tracking them for the past 2 hours, using the refugees as bait to draw out Soviet forces. The trap is elegant in its cruelty. The SS unit, 12 men strong, has positioned itself in a perfect ambush formation around the convoy wreckage. They will wait for Soviet troops to investigate the apparent civilian distress, then eliminate both the rescuers and the refugees, leaving evidence that suggests Soviet forces fired on their own allies. It is a propaganda victory wrapped in a tactical deception, and Volkov realizes with growing horror that his own command post has already dispatched a relief squad toward the scene. His radio crackles with orders to observe and report, but something in the way the youngest civilian clutches that torn doll makes Volkov's finger move almost involuntarily to his trigger. The Mosin-Nagant PU is not designed for rapid engagement. It is a precision instrument meant for single, calculated shots across vast distances. Standard doctrine demands that snipers never reveal their positions for anything less than high-value enemy commanders. Engaging 12 targets with a bolt-action rifle is not just tactically unsound, it is virtual suicide. But as Volkov watches the SS troops begin to close their ring, he finds his breathing naturally slowing, his heartbeat settling into the rhythm that has always preceded his most impossible shots. The white feather in his cap seems to catch what little moonlight filters through the clouds, and for the first time in months, he feels something other than the mechanical execution of orders. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. The first shot takes the SS squad leader through the throat at 400 meters, a shot so clean that the man simply crumples without sound. Before the echo has faded across the tundra, Volkov has cycled his bolt and acquired the machine gunner, the second most dangerous threat to both the civilians and the approaching Soviet relief squad. The second shot punches through the German's chest just as he swings his MG-42 toward the muzzle flash of Volkov's first round. What follows defies every principle of sniper doctrine. Rather than relocating after his initial shots, Volkov remains in position, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to predict exactly how the remaining SS troops will move as they attempt to escape his field of fire. His third shot catches a fleeing soldier at 350 meters. His fourth eliminates the unit's radio operator before the man can call in artillery support. Each shot is fired with an almost supernatural calm, as if the chaos surrounding him has somehow clarified rather than clouded his perception. The white feather in his ushanka no longer feels like superstition. It feels like purpose. The remaining German troops, suddenly finding themselves hunted rather than hunting, begin to break formation. Some attempt to use the civilians as human shields, but Volkov's elevated position allows him to thread shots between the refugees with millimeter precision. His fifth shot takes down an SS trooper who has grabbed the young girl with the doll. His sixth eliminates a soldier attempting to set up a defensive position behind the convoy wreckage. Petrov watches in stunned silence as his lieutenant fires shot after shot with mechanical precision, never missing, never hesitating, never moving from his position. The junior sergeant has seen Volkov make impossible shots before, but never like this. Never with such complete disregard for his own safety, never with such absolute focus on protecting people who, by all rights, should be considered enemy civilians. By the time the Soviet relief squad reaches the scene 12 minutes later, they find 15 unharmed civilians, 6 dead German soldiers, and 6 others fleeing across the open tundra with wounds that will ensure they never reach their own lines. Volkov has expended exactly 12 rounds, 1 for each enemy soldier, and has not moved from his original position. The Finnish refugees huddle together in shocked silence, uncertain whether these new Soviet soldiers represent salvation or a different kind of threat. The little girl still clutches her torn doll, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that war plants in children's hearts. But she is alive, and her family is alive, and that knowledge settles into Volkov's chest with a weight he has not felt before. When Captain Orlov arrives with the relief squad, his face is a mask of barely controlled fury. "What the hell were you thinking, Lieutenant?" Those were direct orders to observe and report. Volkov touches the white feather in his cap and meets his superior's gaze without flinching. "Sometimes calm under fire means knowing when the fire is necessary, comrade." The captain stares at him for a long moment, then gestures to the scene below. 12 Germans, 12 shots. No Soviet casualties. The civilians are unharmed. "Yes, comrade." The incident report will reflect exceptional marksmanship and tactical awareness in eliminating an enemy ambush. What the report will not reflect is the quiet moment when Volkov watched the Finnish girl clutch that doll, or the way his breathing steadied when he chose humanity over orders. How do you measure the weight of a single white feather against the machinery of war? 3 weeks later, in the relative warmth of the command bunker near Murmansk, the white feather incident has become legend among the sniper units. The official story speaks of tactical brilliance and exceptional marksmanship. The unofficial story, whispered around heating stoves and shared over rations of black bread and weak tea, tells of something else entirely. Major Kozlov, the division's political officer, summons Volkov for what he calls a routine assessment of morale and ideological clarity. The bunker smells of wet wool, cigarette smoke, and the perpetual dampness that seeps through even the best constructed shelters in the Arctic winter. "Tell me, Lieutenant, what you were thinking during that engagement," Kozlov says, his pen poised over a form that will become part of Volkov's permanent record. Volkov touches the white feather in his ushanka, now beginning to show wear from constant handling. "I was thinking about the mission, comrade. Protecting Soviet forces from enemy ambush. And the civilians? They were in the line of fire." Kozlov makes a note, then looks up with the calculating expression that political officers perfect through years of reading between lines. "Some of the men say you took unnecessary risks, that you could have called for artillery support instead of engaging personally. Artillery, would have killed the civilians along with the Germans. They were enemy civilians. The statement hangs in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Volkov thinks of the little girl with the torn doll, of the way her small fingers gripped that piece of fabric and cotton as if it contained all the safety in the world. He thinks of his own sister, Katya, back in Tver, who would be about the same age now if the Germans hadn't taken the city. Enemy children, comrade? Kozlov's pen stops moving. The state of war makes many distinctions necessary, Lieutenant. Sentimentality is a luxury we cannot afford. But even as he says it, Volkov can see something flickering behind the Major's eyes. The political officer is perhaps 5 years older than Volkov himself, old enough to remember peacetime, old enough to remember when distinctions between enemy and ally weren't written in the blood of children. That evening, Petrov finds Volkov cleaning his rifle by the pale light of a kerosene lamp. The junior sergeant has been unusually quiet since the incident, and now he settles beside his lieutenant with the careful movements of a man choosing his words. "My mother sent a letter," Petrov says finally. "The Germans retreated from our village last month. She says she found Finnish soldiers sharing their rations with the children who were left behind." Volkov continues working the cleaning rod through his rifle's barrel, but his hands pause for just a moment. "War makes strange neighbors of us all," he says. The white feather in his cap catches the lamplight, and for the first time in weeks, Volkov wonders what other stories are unfolding in the spaces between the battle lines, what other small acts of humanity are occurring in the margins of the official reports. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. What happens when the enemy reveals a face you recognize as human? The ptarmigan appears on a February morning when the aurora borealis paints the sky in shades of green and gold that seem impossible in the endless Arctic night. Volkov spots it during his regular patrol, a flash of white against the snow that moves with the peculiar confidence of a creature perfectly adapted to its environment. He watches the bird for several minutes, noting how it changes direction with each gust of wind, how it seems to find shelter in the smallest depressions of the landscape. When a feather detaches from its wing and drifts toward him, Volkov catches it instinctively, then realizes he is holding a perfect replacement for the worn feather in his ushanka. "You and that superstition," Petrov says, but there is no mockery in his voice anymore. "My grandmother always said ptarmigan feathers carry the wisdom of survival," Volkov replies, tucking the fresh feather beside the old one. "They know when to be still and when to move." What he doesn't say is that the sight of the bird has reminded him of something his grandmother once told him about the winter of 1921, when Finnish soldiers brought medicine to their village during a typhus outbreak. "The uniform doesn't make the heart," she had said, "and the heart doesn't read insignia." Later that day, intelligence reports arrive with news that contradicts everything they have been told about Finnish military capabilities. The enemy positions are not as strong as reported. Their supply lines are stretched thinner than Soviet propaganda suggests. Most surprisingly, captured documents reveal standing orders to minimize civilian casualties wherever possible. Volkov studies these reports in the dim light of the command bunker, his fingers unconsciously finding the white feathers in his cap. The documents paint a picture of an enemy that doesn't match the inhuman monsters described in political briefings. These are soldiers concerned with their own families, their own survival, their own moral choices. Captain Orlov notices his lieutenant's preoccupation. "Something troubling you, Dmitri?" "The intelligence reports, comrade. The enemy seems more organized than we were told, more disciplined, more human. The question hangs between them like a shared secret. Orlov has been a soldier long enough to recognize the weight of moral complexity, the way war has of making simple answers impossible." That evening, Volkov writes a letter to his sister Katya, though he knows it will not reach her for weeks, if at all. In it, he describes the aurora borealis, the way the light dances across the snow like memories of summer. He writes about the ptarmigan, about the wisdom of knowing when to be still and when to move. What he cannot write about is the way his understanding of the war has begun to shift, the way enemy and ally have become categories too simple for the reality he faces every day. He cannot write about the Finnish girl with the torn doll, or the way her image has begun to appear in his dreams alongside memories of his sister. Instead, he closes the letter with a promise to come home safely and a hope that the world they return to will have room for the truths they have learned in the spaces between the official stories. The white feathers in his ushanka seem to glow in the lamplight, carrying their own quiet wisdom about survival, about the choices that define us when no one is watching, about the weight of mercy in a world designed for war. When does protecting the innocent become an act of rebellion? The secret arrives in a sealed envelope marked with the highest classification codes, delivered by courier through the maze of trenches and bunkers that connect the Murmansk front to Moscow. Major Kozlov opens it in the privacy of his quarters, reads it twice, then summons Volkov for what he calls an urgent consultation. The political officer's face bears the expression of a man who has just learned that the ground beneath his feet is less solid than he believed. Lieutenant, what I am about to share with you must never leave this room. Do you understand? Volkov touches the white feathers in his ushanka and nods. Kozlov slides a document across the rough wooden table that serves as his desk. It is a translation of captured Finnish military orders, dated 3 days before the incident with the civilians. The orders explicitly direct all units to provide safe passage for refugee populations and to coordinate with Red Cross representatives whenever possible. They knew about the German ambush, Kozlov says quietly. The Finnish command had intelligence that SS units were using civilian refugees as bait, and they had issued specific warnings to avoid those areas. Volkov studies the document, noting the careful language that speaks of preserving civilian lives while maintaining military objectives. The orders read like something that could have been issued by Soviet command, written with the same careful balance between duty and humanity. The civilians you saved, Kozlov continues, they were trying to reach a Finnish outpost that had been designated as a humanitarian safe zone. The Germans were using them to draw out both Soviet relief forces and Finnish rescue units. The implications settle into Volkov's mind like stones dropped into still water. The enemy he had been taught to hate as inhuman monsters had been trying to save the same civilians he risked everything to protect. The German SS unit had been playing all sides against each other, using human suffering as a tactical weapon. Why are you telling me this, comrade? Kozlov is quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that matches the distant sound of artillery. Because Moscow is beginning to understand that this war is more complicated than our initial assessment suggested. Because there may come a time when we need soldiers who can see past the uniform to the human heart underneath. That night, Volkov lies in his bunk staring at the ceiling of the bunker, listening to the breathing of his fellow soldiers and the endless whisper of wind across the tundra. The white feathers in his ushanka rest beside his pillow, no longer a simple superstition, but a reminder of choices made and prices paid. He thinks of the Finnish girl with the torn doll, wondering if she reached safety, wondering if she will grow up to remember the day when strangers in foreign uniforms chose her life over their orders. He thinks of his sister Katya, hoping she will never have to make the kinds of choices that war forces upon the innocent. The secret Kozlov shared feels like a burden and a gift simultaneously. A burden because it confirms that the world is more complex than propaganda allows, and a gift because it validates the choice he made in that frozen moment when humanity trumped ideology. The truth has a weight that certainty never carried. Spring arrives late to the Murmansk front, marked not by flowers, but by the gradual lengthening of daylight and the sound of melting ice, creating new streams across the tundra. By then, Volkov has been transferred to a reconnaissance unit tasked with monitoring Finnish withdrawal movements as their forces consolidate closer to established borders. The war is winding down, though peace feels more like an exhausted pause than a true resolution. Reports filter through command channels about negotiations in distant capitals, about prisoner exchanges and humanitarian corridors, about the slow machinery of reconciliation beginning to turn. On a clear April morning, Volkov encounters something that will haunt him for decades to come. Through his scope, he watches as a Finnish patrol escorts a group of Soviet prisoners toward an exchange point established by Red Cross negotiations. The prisoners are thin, but walking under their own power, their uniforms patched but clean. Among the Finnish soldiers is a young woman wearing the white armband of a medical officer. She moves with practiced efficiency, checking on the Soviet prisoners, offering water from her canteen, adjusting bandages with the gentle competence that comes from treating suffering regardless of nationality. As the group passes within 200 meters of his position, Volkov sees something that makes his breath catch in his throat. The medical officer pauses to kneel beside one of the Soviet prisoners, a man who appears to be struggling with an injured leg. From her pack, she produces a small object and places it in the man's hands, a carved wooden doll, simple but carefully crafted. Through his scope, Volkov can see the prisoner's face transform with emotion. The man clutches the doll against his chest with the same protective gesture Volkov remembers from a little girl, holding her torn doll in the midst of a German ambush. When he lowers his rifle, Volkov realizes his hands are shaking. The white feathers in his ushanka seem to whisper with the accumulated weight of all the choices that brought him to this moment. The choice to fire when orders said observe. The choice to protect when doctrine said destroy. The choice to see human faces where ideology painted monsters. The war ends officially on May 9th, 1945, but for Volkov it ends in that moment of recognition that mercy has its own momentum, creating ripples that extend far beyond the immediate moment of choice. Years later, when he returns to civilian life in Tver, Volkov will work as a forester, spending his days among trees that have no nationality, following paths that lead wherever they choose to lead. He never marries, but he corresponds regularly with his sister Katya, who becomes a teacher and fills her letters with stories of children who remind him that the future always holds the possibility of choosing differently. The incident report filed that December night in 1942 mentions nothing of ptarmigan feathers or moral superstitions. It records only that Senior Lieutenant Volkov eliminated an enemy ambush through exceptional marksmanship and tactical awareness, saving both civilian refugees and Soviet personnel. But among the veterans of the Murmansk front, a different story spreads about the sniper who fired 12 impossible shots in 12 minutes, never moving, never missing, never losing the peculiar serenity that comes from choosing humanity over doctrine. Finnish military historians will later identify this engagement as one of the few documented cases where Soviet forces risked their own tactical advantages to protect enemy civilians. The young girl with the torn doll grows up to become a nurse in Helsinki, never knowing that her survival depended on a Russian sniper's decision to trust his instincts over his orders, to value human life over military objectives, and to find in a simple white feather the clarity that no amount of training could provide. In his small apartment in Tver, Dmitry Volkov keeps the white feathers from his ushanka in a wooden box beside his bed. Sometimes, on nights when sleep will not come, he takes them out and holds them up to the lamplight, remembering the weight of choices made in the space between heartbeats, the way mercy can become a form of resistance, and the truth that humanity persists even in the machinery of war. The feathers have grown brittle with age, but they still carry their quiet wisdom about survival, about knowing when to be still and when to move, about the way small acts of courage can echo across decades like stones dropped into still water. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel. Tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What do you carry with you from the moments when you chose mercy over convenience?